English soldiers at the Battle of Agincourt. And they all had discipline.
That wasn't a very good joke.
Yikes, but they won. So I'm trying to get rid of the, there we go, all right. Any questions you have? Now I made a switch. I made a change. So, and the first of those terms that aren't bold, I'm going to basically divide those up into two groups, and you have to answer. There'll be 6 short IDs from them. You have to do 6 from those first group that aren't bold. So I'll make 2 columns, pick 3 from each column, and I kind of do it by order, do chronological order. So that first group, I'll give you about 6 of those, and then you IDs with it. Second column ID. Sound good? And then the next one, then the one's bold, you got to do 12. 80/52. I was going to do 19 total, but then I would just, I'm teaching 6 classes instead of 5, so I'm thinking time to grade. I know you guys want to do 20, right? But I'm actually thinking about time to get them all done. So we might do 18. I will decide. You're doing 18. All right. So there'll be 18 total. Remember, these are 3 sentence short IDs. That's really not that much. You're 3 sentences. I know you got to know stuff, you got to do it, and you have to write, but it's really not. Summary, remember brief summary, example of it, example of it in action, example of what happened, and then what it led to. Yes. No, these are just short IDs, so it's just short little paragraphs. You start writing. And you don't need a topic sentence. The big thing though, you have to, especially on the final, start with the term and number them. Just because I get so many and I grade a lot, I get mixed up. So when I got a big stack to grade, you understand, so make it easy on me. Yeah. So that's about 30. Which isn't. Control yourself. I know it just came out, but we can get better words. No, 30% is not. 30% is enough. That if you're close, it's enough to bring you up. It's also enough to bring you down, I know. If you're in the middle of a score, let's say like 85 or 95, and then you absolutely blow it, which you won't. I was like, I don't know. It won't tank. So I want it big enough, like let's say you're an 88. You really do well, there's a chance to get that. So 30% is enough. That's why I make it that much. If I make it lower than that, it's only enough to do if you're like, if you're like 89. If I make it like 15. That's why I do it. So I'm not even thinking like third. I'm just thinking what's enough, and it's about 30%. Sound good? And so when I grade it, I'll give it, I'll make it out about 200 points, and then I'll multiply it by 3. Boom. That's how I do it. All right. Let's look at the list. Any questions I will answer. Oh, and then before we answer your first, but look at the last column. I made this hoping I would get to some things I didn't quite make. So if you look down and it says business cycle, all the way down except for the Panic of 1873, I'm not going to go to. So I'm just going to give you more of the other choices. I really was hoping. So add one to replace them. Factors of the second industrial revolution. I'm going to get to the factors tomorrow, and so that'll be my just add one, and that will be a choice. Okay, that will be your choice. That's what you're going to miss when you're making this. Sound good? Okay. And so I will arrange yours so you're okay. So don't worry, you have plenty of choices. You get it right what you know. You're out, no problem. Okay, question. Nullification. So nullification, and that's like in the second column, is that right? So that's 1833, 3233, and that is. What do you know? I got the list. Oh, got the list. Very good. So nullification crisis. And that is when, led by Calhoun, the South nullified the tariff to find that issue to unify the South to protect slavery. Unify the South. The whole idea was to unify the South to protect slavery. So an example of what happened, that is when Jackson did the Forks Bill to keep that from happening, and a compromise tariff. Kind of the carrot and the stick to end the nullification crisis. And what was the result of this? Nullification crisis. Jackson saved the Union. Saved the Union. But did not solve the sectional divide over slavery. And with nullification gone, that means secession is the next step. Does that make sense? Didn't save the Union. I mean, save the Union, but not stop civil war. So, Jackson, a very curious man. That's why we need to focus on all those elements of Jackson. Another one, taxation. So British taxation, you have to just mention a couple of the laws of British mercantile policy of taxation. So you mentioned like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, or Stamp Act and the Township Acts. I mean, the Stamp Act and the Tea Act are the two biggies. But British imperial policy or the Proclamation line of 1760. But all those lines, and those are the two laws to enforce mercantilism. And basically, an example of that would happen, that created like the Stamp Act, Congress, boycotts. And the result of that would be the American Revolution. Those restrictions would directly lead to the revolution. Oh, one more thing. So if you're using examples or what it led to, they could be other things on the list that you're going to show an ID. They do relate. So mercantilism and British policy, an example of that would be the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. And you can use those again if you answer the next one. The one you answered about British taxation policies. So you can use them in other things. Other short IDs, you can use other terms. They're not. They all relate. And if you remember them related, it's a lot easier to remember. If you just try to remember this as individual little factoids, it's a lot harder to remember, doesn't make as much sense, and it will go away immediately. Connect them. You can find those connections and it makes it easier to recall. Especially when most of you be taking the AP exam, you got to go back over this all again. It really helps. But then you have those little connections. Oh, I remember that. I remember that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Tecumseh, Tippecanoe. So Tecumseh, that would be that last stand by the tribes of the Old Northwest, trying to stop the United States after the U.S. broke all those treaties. Tecumseh tried to create a confederacy. And I'm thinking Tippecanoe as an example of what happened. But what happened was Tecumseh's confederacy would be destroyed by the United States at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And when the Battle of Tippecanoe happened, that would be the last chance for American Indians to stop the expansion of the United States. And just as important, that's when citizens of the US started calling themselves Americans. This is our continent. Another one. I'll do a couple more. And then tomorrow we'll do the same thing. And I'll do it for a few more minutes on Tuesday. And then you guys' test is the first one on Thursday, right? Sound right to everybody? Okay.
I just had a better question. I know, like in the past, like for example, if we were writing a short idea about fortification law, that you had to include black or like
Yeah, black. Yeah.
Or
Like if you do the fornication laws or like, but the big thing I had like slave codes or Bacon's Rebellion.
don't include the main point. Well, you
There'll be
can't
a few of those. Yeah, maybe one or two. Yeah. So try to, and you have to ask individual ones, but the point is, the things I really try to emphasize in class. Like Bacon's Rebellion, you have to mention slave codes and racism. If you don't mention the development of slave codes and racism with Bacon's Rebellion, you get half on. I'm just telling you right now, it's half on. But that's the most important thing. Yes, Tom. What was it? A law. Anything else? Compromise of 1850. That was after the deal with the Mexican cession. And that was gonna be Clay's idea to solve all the problems. And, okay, there are 5 big things with the Compromise of 1850. But the most important ones, with the Compromise of 1850, would set up the idea of popular sovereignty in Utah, New Mexico, and the fugitive slave laws. Remember the fugitive slave laws? And so those are the big examples of what happened. So, Compromise of 1850 would deal with the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession, right? Examples in law, big ones. The 2 most important, fugitive slave law and popular sovereignty. And then what was the result? It ended the threat of civil war. It ended the threat, but did not solve the issue of slavery in the territories, which would come up again in like the Kansas-Nebraska Act or Dred Scott. You're one of those things down the road. That's what you would say. So that wouldn't solve the problem. That would lead to Kansas-Nebraska, bleeding Kansas, one of those things. Yeah. Dred Scott decision. Is that in the 3rd column? Second column, Dred Scott. And that's a big. So Dred Scott was a court decision about whether or not slaves would become free in free territory. So that was a decision whether or not slaves would become free. The Supreme Court ruled that slaves are property, and therefore they're slaves no matter where they're at. And so this was a ruling, and so it threw out like the Missouri Compromise, the Northwest Ordinance. And this is what Justice Taney thought would solve the problem. Slavery. Solve the problem. But what it led to is it furthered the sectional divide. And it really angered Northern Republicans and got them power by saying, see, they're going to try to make us all become a slave state. And so it actually furthered the free soil idea. And also angered the South because the North was mad at it. It would be thrown out with the 13th and 14th. Yeah. Lost cause. Lost cause is a biggie. I will be on there. That idea that the war wasn't really about slavery. The war was about Northern aggression and tariffs. And that's where you get the war between the states and all that garbage. And so those are examples of it. And the big thing it led to is this is going to be taught in schools. They'll revise history. People are going to learn the lost cause and not know the reality of the Civil War. That's where you get and lead to like the Reconstruction myth, Gone with the Wind myth. There's another one. One more. Then we'll do it again tomorrow. Sound good? 10 minutes? These are good reviews. This is what we do like before the AP exam. I won't answer any question. Some maybe even correct. There's a good chance half will be correct. Yeah. Trenton, Princeton. Those are the turning point battles in many ways of the Revolutionary War that proved there were small victories by Washington after New York City fell, but it proved to colonists that they were in the fight and they could win. And it confirmed one very important point, what it meant to. The United States, the Continental Army, didn't have to win the battles. They just had to survive. And the British would eventually leave New York. So, have questions tomorrow? Sound good? You're going. Tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow I'll take the test.
Yeah, we'll take the test. And I'll wherever I finish today, I'll make sure that you won't have any comments. Thank you. Don't worry. It'll all be for the 20th. You can show off right ahead. All right, so let's go take another down first. Same deal, tomorrow I'll answer questions. So I'm leaning towards 18 short ID just because it's a time crunch. So much further ahead than the other classes. We should do like 24. I mean, this class is amazing.
We're not where I would want it. It's pretty.
Huh?
Just talk about. Well, we're not where.
I'm behind in every class. I'm behind in everything. Everything always takes longer than I think. All right, so did we get to this?
Yes.
Did we just start Sand Creek?
Cheyenne.
We
Yeah, we
said-
were all thinking you're talking about the Cheyenne.
Did we get this?
Oh,
No.
That's
If you get militia,
got to
so. We got right there, Shivington, we got hunting ground, economic warfare, mining, okay. So here's what happened. The miners need the food, did we mention the militia? So they sent the army out, Shivington, he wanted to get fame. He wanted this victory, and they're pretty well equipped because of the Civil War. The thing is, they couldn't find any tribes until they found an encampment. And it was known as Black Kettle's encampment. Remember, the United States always dealt with one man, even though it was much more complex than tribes. Black Kettle had already signed a treaty saying that he would not harass buffalo hunters. And he was flying an American flag at his encampment. They were flying a flag, a US flag very similar to that flag. And Shivington got there, and they had been tramping around the winter in Colorado, whole plains in eastern Colorado, and he figured, what's the difference? One Cheyenne is as good as another. And he ordered, they were hunkered down in the winter, he ordered an attack at dawn. And he gave the orders to kill everybody over 10, to murder them all. In fact, he was asked by a subordinate, what about children? And his response, nits make lice. Nits are lice not. And the idea is kill them when they're young. This is a brutal, horrific attack. I should have that. They took him totally by surprise. A few other people came out and tried to fight, and they basically shot into teepees, trampled them over, crushed them with horses. The thing that saved about half the encampment, even though 200 are going to be slaughtered massacred. It would be a horrible massacre. And a template for future wars for the United States. What saved him is Shivington and his men were so drunk, that so disorganized that the attack fell apart. But this is how the United States would attack for the rest of the time on the front. If they can do it. Or sunup in the winter. Winter campaigns. So Black Kettle would flee to kind of the southern end of Cheyenne hunting ground, right about here in Oklahoma. And the buffalo hunters slaughtering this southern herd. And Cheyenne, Kiowa, etc., trying to defend their land. And Black Kettle's camp would be attacked again by cavalry in the winter on a creek called Washita in 1869 in Oklahoma. Another surprise attack, and people died, and most of them men, women, and children in that camp. It was the 7th U.S. Cavalry, and their second in command of the cavalry was in charge that day, a guy named George Custer, who we have mentioned before. And he just about got destroyed by larger forces. He kind of been a little bit inept there, but he was already famous for the Civil War, become even more famous as this great Indian fighter. So next, Sandy Creek is a good place to start. This is going to tie in with the mines. Speaking of mines, we've got the Montana gold mines. But how did they get supplies there? John Bozeman would lay out a trail. So the railroad was just being built here. Would lay out a trail that would connect. The railhead was about here, present day Grand Island, Nebraska, up to Montana and the minefields in Virginia City and Bannock. And you can imagine what's going to happen. That's going to cut right through the northern herds of the Lakota and the Cheyenne, most of the Lakota. The Lakota had just swept in and conquered this area, literally just conquered it. Oh yeah, divide and conquer. They're fighting all the time. The Lakota were conquerors too of land. Gee, I wonder what the city's going to be named after John Bozeman. Yeah, Missoula. That's Missoula, of course. And the U.S. Army built 3 forts along this trail. Did anyone catch my typo? Yeah, put the Bozeman triangle. I didn't catch it. I was been typing very quickly and I realized I just left it about that. So, 3 forts: Kearney, Smith, and Reno. 3 Civil War generals. Boom, boom, boom. Well, the Lakota immediately countered that, and this would be known as Red Cloud's War. And the Lakota cut off the trail. In fact, they even besieged the forts that winter of 1868. And the Lakota did incredibly well. The army now was tiny. They reduced the size after the war. Most of the men were on Reconstruction duty. This is right after the Military Reconstruction Act. So all along this trail, this is Red Cloud, one of the most important Lakota at this time. And so that's why the battles after him, even though I should add, these are more like warrior societies. The United States had the advantage of having a disciplined army. Not individual fighters. As brave as they were, individuals have a disadvantage. To give you an idea about the way this fight was, John Fetterman was a captain. He rode out from Fort Phil Kearny, right here in Wyoming, where most of the intense fighting was, following a few Lakota, including a guy named Crazy Horse, and ran right into an ambush. And all of them, all 81 men with him, his understrength company were all killed. That gives you an idea of the ferocity of the fighting. But just 2 weeks later, a wagon cutting expedition. So they had, wood cutting in wagons. So it's called the wagon box fight. There's a painting of it. They were ambushed by hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne. And because they had good protection and using the discipline and not being ambushed, they fought them off and won this battle. That is the marking where the wagon box fight is. And the reason I'm showing that is because that's another one of my, sometimes I luck out, I'm not a great photographer, but that's a pretty cool picture, isn't it? That one turned out really well. Every once in a while, that's the thing. Just take pictures and hope for the best. So, yes, there are people who are really good eye, but this brutal fight, finally the United States basically just gave in. And at the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, they accepted. They abandoned the forts and the Lakota won. But they also agreed to go on a reservation. And there were a lot of Lakotas that don't do this. Men like, we'll get to it in a sec, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Don't do this. Once you're on the reservation, you become theirs. And you become dependent on them. But this was a victory. This all ties into what's coming up, the Little Bighorn. So this is a reservation right here. Huge. Basically, half of South Dakota will be the Great Sioux Reservation. The Black Hills technically wasn't in the reservation, but the Lakota had just conquered it. So they said, we're not giving up what we conquered. This is ours. This is our prestige. Other tribes, it's more kind of like almost like a mystical spot. To the Lakota, it was just ours. We took it from the Crow. And all this area here in the west, in the summer, tribal members could go out and hunt buffalo, bison. But you know what's happening to the bison? You eat fast by the 1870s. But reservation life was pretty often. They were promised food and shelter, and very little of it arrived. I should add, in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, it promised that the United States would care and provide for the tribes as payment for giving up their land. For how long? Anyone know? Forever. I don't know if you know this, but forever is a long time. Now we can debate what provide and care for means, but that's how the United States will pay for it, and they weren't caring for it very well. We'll get to that in just 1 second. Well, this will trigger what's called the Great Sioux War. And for those of us in Montana, this will be the culmination of the so-called Indian War, because Montana's right in the center of it. That's where the buffalo hunting area was. So there's gold discovered in the Black Hills. It was actually a mapping expedition led by George Custer, the same one I mentioned before. And he wasn't supposed to tell, but he brought reporters with him and let it out. Well, you can imagine what's going to happen. There's gold there. Thus, a gold rush. And this, people started coming in. They blatantly violated the treaty, and you can imagine what's going to happen. Even though Grant talked about it, they didn't kick the prospectors out, and the U.S. would protect them. They just blatantly violated the treaty. So once that happened, you might have heard of Deadwood or Lead, even though it was, those were cities spread at that time. The Lakota and Cheyenne, who were on these reservations, allies together, they said to heck with it. And thousands went to that bison range in the west and said, we're staying. And they joined those who refused to follow Leg Crowd into the reservation, like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse or Gall. Here's Custer. And these are Crow and Assiniboine scouts. Remember, divide and conquer. Custer's a curious guy. Well, they started this war. So the United States decided, basically went to Grant and said, they're gonna have to be forced on that reservation and punished. And so this basically ended Grant's peace plan to be, to try to find more of a compromise with the tribes. Still favoring the US. And a massive three-pronged US Army assault. There weren't very many US troops. So this is like 3/4 of the US Army in the West. So basically, from Bozeman and Missoula, under John Gibbon, one of the heroes of Gettysburg, another Civil War hero under General Crook this way, and under General Terry this way. And riding with Terry, that is the 7th Cavalry under the commander, their second in command, George Custer. He was a lieutenant colonel. The army reduced the size, so he lost rank. And basically what happened was, they're hoping to pinch in all of these, they call them summer wanderers who went to the bison range. And they thought there might be a few thousand. There might have been as many as 8,000. And in early June, they kind of unified right here on Rosebud Creek and moved this way. It was actually a battle against Crook's forces they won. Custer was sent down here to find them. And the thing was, they were worried in the summer. These nomadic tribes were so good at just looking away and then ambushing. So Custer was basically, they all knew, see him, attack. Because we want to make them fight, defeat them, force them on the reservation. So Custer and about 400 men were scouting below the Yellowstone, and they found them on the Little Bighorn River. It's called the river. It's June 25th, 1876. And Custer was on this patrol with the 7th Cavalry. That's Custer in the middle. Now, we don't have time to go through the whole detail. I would highly recommend if you get a chance, go to the battlefield. Well, have you been there? Anyone else been in the Little Bighorn? Few? They do an amazing job. It's really something to see. And they try, especially in the last 40 years, they try to show both sides of the story and what happened, do a good job. Sitting Bull was probably the leading Lakota. He had fought the United States for years in their expansion. He was probably too old to fight then, even though he was a little bit. He was more of a spiritual leader. Crazy Horse was the most famous soldier, but since it was more individual fighters, it's more like his greatness would influence men to follow. We don't know what Crazy Horse looks like, so I took a watercolor. He refused to have his picture taken. Why would you want to steal my shadow? He would respond to anybody who wanted to take his picture. And so, Custer stumbled across this camp, and even though he had reinforcements, he said, I got to attack now. He divided his army up into 4, thinking they might run away. And he took about half of his force to try to sweep around this big encampment. The plan was to take women and children hostage and force the warriors to surrender. That was his plan. It's a horrible plan. I mean, it's brutal, awful. But in the process, he would be captured and surrounded by superior forces. They had never seen an encampment that big. There were probably 1,500 fighters. And he just overwhelmed his 260 men. And every man who rode with Custer, half of his force would die. The other half would hold down a hill called Reno's Hill. This is Custer's Hill, where his body and the last remnants would be found. And they dug it pretty close to where they found the bodies. So a couple days afterwards, they found the bodies and they buried them right away. And then they went back and reinterred them. And these are them reinterring the bodies. And they just kind of, bodies. So wherever you see a tombstone, that is where they found the body. And there are some where they have various Lakota or Cheyenne. But you can imagine when they first did it, this was all done by the US Army. So they only cared about the US Army. And this is a painting by a Lakota on Standing Rock Reservation 20 years after the battle. The battle lasted against Custer's forces about 20 minutes. It's just overwhelming. It's an interesting story. If you get a chance, go there. I've been there many times. I also grew up in that area. One of the times I went there when I was in high school, I was at Reno's Hill, and a rattlesnake struck him. And And that's when you would have seen me, you would have seen my very impressive 60-inch vertical. I jumped up. It missed me probably by about, in reality, a foot. But in my memory, maybe an inch. I remember that, but I remember that. And there's something wrong with snakes. I don't like snakes anyways. And I don't like especially venomous snakes. You know what I mean? There's something wrong with snakes. There's no legs. That ain't right. Okay, moving on. If you get a chance, go there. This would be the greatest victory. This would be the greatest victory for the Plains American Indians, and the second biggest victory of American Indians over the United States Army. The biggest would be St. Clair's defeat way back in 1791. But it also was guaranteed. Guess when the news of this arrived back in Washington? Anybody want to guess? June 25th. So there's a steamboat with General Terry's force. It went down the Bighorn, and then Little Bighorn is really shallow, but it made it pretty close. And it brought back wounded, chugged along the Yellowstone to the Missouri, then made it back to Bismarck, North Dakota, which is Fort Abraham Lincoln. That's where the telegraph line was. Look at that. Look at what day was the battle? 25th. What's coming up? It made the newspapers in the East. June 25th. No, it's gonna take days to get back. July 4th. Did you say that?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear that. 1876. The centennial. There was a big celebration for 100 years. And it came to this humiliating defeat of a general, well, lieutenant colonel, that everyone knew Custer. A humiliating defeat. And now, Grant has no choice. We're jumping right to this. This will lead to the destruction of this. And a winter campaign, 76, 77. They will build forts all over Montana, Wyoming, Dakotas to hem them in and run them down. Crazy Horse would finally bring his followers into camp because they dispersed after the battle because it was too big of an encampment in the summer. Sitting Bull fled to Canada for a few years, trying to get to freedom, but that turned out to be miserable too for him, and he came back. After Crazy Horse surrendered, or he didn't really surrender, but he said, we'll give in. In 1877, he would be, there'd be a disagreement about a few things, about what's happened to Nez Perce, and we would be killed. It's 1877. And these are crook soldiers in Wyoming, but they would be run down, and they would be forced on different reservations. These would become the Lakota reservations. Much smaller reservations, and they would be spots of absolute misery. Because in the year, even after with that victory, over half of the Lakota would die. And remember, they're already devastated by disease. One thing I should add, one of the forts they built right here would be Fort Keogh, named after a captain in Custer's forces. And the commander was a guy named Nelson Biles, major. He eventually became the commander of the U.S. Army. So a little town. Little towns always form near forts. You'd have bars and brothels and stuff. You know what happens with soldiers. And they named this little town after the commanding officer. So that became Miles Town. It became Miles City, which is the town called London. Will be named after one of this fort after that. And the county I grew up in is Custer County. In fact, the high school I went to was Custer County High School. It's the Cowboys. Okay, so 1877 in Nez Perce. It was Class A. When I was in school, our high school had about 700 students. It was a big school. Now it's about 450. Little towns are, those medium-sized towns are all becoming little towns. So, Nez Perce. So, the Nez Perce was a tribe in Washington and Oregon and Idaho. And they were going to be forced to the reservation. They were going to be forced to a reservation. They basically just told them, after what happened with the Lakota, they said, you're going to a reservation. We don't care about a treaty. And this was their traditional homeland, and they're going to be sent to a much drier, desolate reservation here. And some of them fought back. And so the US Army was going to come out under Civil War general named Howard and going to take care of them. And they ran. The Nez Perce ran, and their thought was, let's get to Montana. That's where we know they're there. And their political leader would be a guy named Chief Joseph. And Chief Joseph was also a warrior, but the big thing was he could organize this kind of diverse group of Nez Perce. About 750, 200 fighters. And they were some of the best fighters and much more disciplined than the Lakota. And they're going to go across Idaho into Montana, defeat a army force here, defeat even a bigger army under General Gibbon at the Big Hole, go through the brand new Yellowstone National Park is literally just created, rush past some army here and try to make it to Canada, and they were stopped right there. They were stopped right there, and they didn't make it. But they defeated the US Army in 3 or 4 battles, but they were captured. Chief Joseph was be put in prison. But this is going to get back to the press. And there was a popular anger that's talk about using these kind of racialized terms, these savages. But then they would say, this got sympathy for this fight for their homeland. And that's when you start seeing this. It's still very demeaning, really demeaning. But this noble savage, oh, sure, they're inferior, but they're just fighting for their land. And so there'll be a lot of sympathy. And this is going to get all the way to Washington, D.C. We have to do something to help these tribal members. And what's the only way to help them? Make them become like white farmers. That is coming. That's Chief Joseph. And I'm going through this very fast. The Nez Perce wore this kind of bareback slip back. And so I always look at that and I see 1950s pompadour haircuts. So I look like a, cool haircut. Looks like Elvis. So, Bureau of Indian Affairs. I think it's kind of, I liked him. And I like how the hair, when he got his picture taken, this is after he's taken prisoner. Joseph made sure that hair was, that's a cool picture. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs would administer these reservations. And they were infamous for corruption. They were called Indian agents. And they would steal money that was supposed to go to feed the tribes and keep them. Stealing money from the government and making money off the government is called graft. Happens to this day. Graft. Credit Mobilier scandal is an example of graft. And reservation life was hell. So on the plains, it might be difficult, but if the bison were plentiful, they were never hungry. And they would have food saved all winter long. But on the reservations, especially the Lakota would talk about for the first time, they're starving. And it wasn't like that before. Now, of course, when the bison are almost gone. And you go from societies based upon nomadic life and men and women having certain roles to totally gone in reservations, especially for the young men, because so much of their life was based upon warrior societies, and they were gone, just gone. And the story was on these reservations, especially in South Dakota, would be people living there had more friends and relatives amongst the dead than the living. Reservation was awful. It wasn't what they were promised. And that's going to lead to one of the saddest religions in American history. It's called the ghost dance. And the ghost dance, a Paiute, who also went to a Christian school, so at Paiute and this kind of, and Protestant Christianity would guard his faith. There's Wovoka right there. Preached this religion that spread like wildfire. That if you did this dance and did this dance long enough, Jesus would come back. Remember, it's a combination. The whites would disappear. The white buffalo would disappear. Your ancestors and everything would come back. Meaning we could go back to the way it was before. If you did it long enough. And so sometimes they wore ghost dance shirts. That's one from this one's Cheyenne. And it shows you how just sad and desperate. This is really sad. But to many of these Indian agents and the forts around these reservations, they thought, is this another Lakota uprising? Especially when Sitting Bull, who had come back Sitting Bull, who thought this was silly, but liked that it angered the United States, they thought he's going to lead another uprising. But ironically, this is a drawing of the ghost dance. It was dying by 18. It was a brief flame. It spread all over and it was dying. But then politics got in the way. The Republicans were very worried about the next election, especially the next presidential election in 1892. So they thought a war would help the GOP. Remember, that's the Republicans, the Grand Old Party. Let's have a war. So they began to exaggerate the threat of the ghost dance. And it was literally dying by that summer. And going into the fall, they sent word from Washington, D.C., you got to crack down on the ghost dancers. And they were basically all gone. And they decided we have to arrest Sitting Bull to stop this. And in the process, they killed Sitting Bull. And when Sitting Bull was killed, that led to panic on the reservations. Oh my God, they're going to slaughter us all. And you can understand why they would feel that way. We're now in the winter in the Dakotas in 1890. And they fled Standing Rock that December to go to Pine Ridge Reservation. And the U.S. cavalry was sent to stop them. 7th Cavalry, the same cavalry unit that Custer would command. And they would stop them. They stopped them right about here. Here's cavalry. Here's a drawing of this. It's 20 or 30 degrees below zero. And it's windy. I can't even imagine the misery of this walk. There were a few young men of fighting age, but most were the elderly or children. This is just a sad, horrible thing of people panicking and scared. And when the cavalry stopped them, they tried to disarm them. And that would be at Wounded Knee. A shot was fired, and the cavalry opened up. In fact, half of the Indians were disarmed, so they couldn't even defend themselves. And the cavalry bought a weapon that Custer refused to bring back in 1876. Has anyone heard of a Gatling gun? Kind of a precursor to a machine gun. And they slaughtered them. Over 250 people, men, women, and children would be killed. Wounded Knee would be called a battle. The U.S. Army would give a bunch of medals to act like it was a real battle. But this is a massacre. And this is going to have real meaning to American Indians to this day. Wounded Knee. Because this was not an armed insurrection. This was not a fight even. This was not anything. This was panicky, scared, terrified people who were slaughtered and they couldn't even bury the bodies because the ground was frozen. Here is probably one of the leaders. He's one of the older Lakota who led them. His body's frozen solid. These are frozen. So they couldn't be buried. They couldn't be buried until the next. Wounded Knee is has meaning. But that would be, as I started a St. Creed. That is a perfect way to end these fights. And what's going to happen then to the tribal members? They knew it was a slaughter. This is from 1891. This is from a newspaper in the United States. They knew it was a slaughter. U.S. tried to say, oh no, it was a battle. No, it was a slaughter. So, the Dawes Act. This is a biggie. This one is so important that this will be one, you will have to ID this one. This should be very just be tomorrow. You have to ID this one on your semester test. So the Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act was going to turn to save these tribal members, to save these noble savages. And that's literally what they said, which is mind-boggling. The racism that kind of drips from that. In fact, the term racism would come from the treatment of American Indians. The term would be invented. We know I told you it was invented back in Bacon's Rebellion, but they didn't have a term yet. The term we invented for this. Once again, one of the. But how would they do that? We'll make them become white farmers. They'll be given a homestead. Then they could assimilate it to, they literally said, white culture, to become white farmers. Now, so you're adding color of skin. Does color of skin change that way? And all of a sudden you just become white? Or in a way, what do you mean? Different shades of skin tone? It doesn't work that way. So that means it's doomed from the start. And you can imagine what's going to happen. So they're going to divvy up the reservation into homesteads, 160 acres. These are people that had not really farmed, full-time farmers. And now they're going to be told, hey, become a farmer, make money. So you give up your tribal membership, take this farm, good luck, and in 20 years you own it. Anybody want to take that deal and do something you've never done in your life? Most didn't do it. They didn't take land divvied up on the reservations. So what happened? Most land was not claimed. And those who did claim it, they would go bankrupt within 30 years. So they're on reservations, they have this little farm and they go bankrupt. Well, hey, if they're not going to use this land, do we want it to go to waste? So then they turned around and gave the land not claimed to non-reservation members. I think you could probably guess who's going to get the land, right? Has everyone got that? They actually had a name for this. It's going to be called the White Land Rush. And they're going to come in and take land on reservations that was supposed to be given to reservation members. In fact, there'll be a term for this a little bit later on. They did it in Oklahoma. Remember Indian Territory? They opened it up and there was a rush, a land rush to come in and take your claim. People rode in to land that was supposed to be given to the tribe. Like you put a little flag and try to claim your land for your homestead. And the thing is, the first one who got the claim got the land. So you better get there sooner than later to get your land. And that's where the term Sooners will come from. Now Oklahoma calls themselves a Sooner state. For example, the University of Oklahoma, their mascot, or whatever is, they're the Sooners. And that's a legacy of taking land promised to American Indians. That's Sooners. We have an interesting history. Well, anybody want to guess what's going to happen? These are the reservations in Montana. But this is brand new, really. But these, a lot of reservations. What's going to happen? I'll give you an example. Pretty darn good land here, isn't it? Anybody want to guess what percentage of this land are owned by the Pender Lane or the Flathead tribe? What percent of the reservation are owned by tribal members? About 30. 70% of the land on the reservation are owned by non-tribal members. Over 60% of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation owned by non-tribal members. And anybody want to guess what land the non-tribal members got? You think some money would have passed hands to make sure they got the best land? Today, on reservations, 50% of the land are owned by non-tribal members. If you look at this map of the Flathead Reservation and see the little gold, see the gold ones? That's land owned by tribal members. Look at all this land. There are reasons why there are problems on reservations. Poverty on reservations, some reservations size 50%. Why? Because all the best land's given to somebody else. So you can imagine what's going to happen on these reservations. This is huge. I've been to the Northern Cheyenne Reservation many times. A good friend of mine, Shannon, Ernie, Lisa, good friends of mine from Miles City, were all Northern Cheyenne. Good friends of mine. I went to their grandparents' home. And I remember going through this little kid and all these big, prosperous farms. And they told me, try to be nice about it, but still angry. Oh yeah, they're not Cheyenne. They're not Cheyenne. It's really sad. But this justified taking the land. This justified taking the land. See? They're just impoverished. They would have wasted the land. Well, there's reasons they're impoverished. So the Dawes Act is one of the most important laws in the world. So the whole goal was we will save these noble savages. And what happened? Reasons why things are good. You can imagine people who are racist would use this for something else. Everyone got that? The Dawes Act, you must answer on the test. I almost forgot to tell you that. The Dawes Act or the Gettysburg Address. You can answer both, but you must answer one or the other. Since we just did the Dawes Act, I know you're going to do that. You can answer both, but you must ask one of those. Sound good to everybody? All right. Yeah.
For when they involved politics, was that Republicans?
Yeah, Republicans. Republicans have slight majorities, and there's a Republican president. Yeah, I wonder if war would ever be used for politics again. In virtually every country. Since you know a lot about Turkey, that's happened in Turkey right now in Syria.
Oh, yeah.
Against Kurds, and then blaming Kurd. Yeah.
Isn't it crazy how some people that they're like currently working on a monument for it? I saw it, but it was in progress, like on my custard trip, we went through into, we were going to South Dakota and stopped.
when, remind me to mention that tomorrow.
Oh, the
The
monument.
Great North Monument.
And then, yeah, and then I think I brought this up, like the whole like Chippewa Cree thing too. Like that was because like we weren't even federally recognized until like 2017.
Yeah, it's less than a decade
Like, oh
old.
yeah, no, the federally recognized, the reservation's even younger because it was supposed to be the Rocky Boy. Like, and then for the longest time, like Little Shell Chippewa Creek wasn't even like recognized. You'd have to tell people, oh, I'm like Rocky Boy, for them to even like realize what you were talking about.
I remember that. I remember
Because my
people.
grandma talked about it all the time because we are Cree, so she like brings it up every time. Like, we weren't even federally recognized until like 2017.
I don't blame her.
Oh, yeah, no, because she's, and then my foster family, like her, dad used to work in one of the boarding schools in like near Billings. Like, it's crazy.
Oh, really? I want to talk about real quick tomorrow about the boy.
Okay, right.
Okay, real.
I was just wondering if you have a letter.
I just have to print it and I'm excited to give you put in a letter.
Thank you.
In fact, I had it already and I was gonna print it yesterday and
That's okay.
and I totally forgot, but I will have it. Yeah. We're not gonna have a quiz. Not gonna have one. I mentioned that beginning. What did I want? Oh, the example of that, something to the effect of, just kind of said the example of it in action. So basically, kind of confirmed that was, or that they chose Hayes as president, got a certain postmaster. So it just showed that the note was up there. And what it led to, that's a Republican basically, and then what eventually became. Good question. We have a few more classes. Workers. You guys are entertaining. There'll be no quiz, because everything took longer than I thought. I blame society, I blame man's inhumanity to man. Right, you with me on that?
Yeah.